بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. We want to welcome you to this session. And in this session we have, inshallah, some of the most thoughtful thinkers in the Muslim community, who are not only thinkers but also activists. And they will be sharing with you their own lessons learned, their own understanding of the past and the present of the Muslim community. Our first speaker is our dear sister Dalia Mogahed. She is a product of the American Muslim community and is now presently a researcher. She's been doing research in the Muslim world, the American Muslim community, for many years, working with Gallup for many years, and now she is the director of research for the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, ISPU, one of the leading think tanks in the Muslim community today. And so I ask her to lead us off.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you all for taking the time to be here with us this evening and skipping your dinner break to hear what we have to say. Our topic this evening is, what are the lessons we can draw in moving forward from the legacy of the civil rights movement and from what we've learned looking globally as well as domestically? What I'd like to share with you are what I think are three important lessons that American Muslims should draw from the experience of other communities as well as Islamic history. And I think these are really important to talk about right now because we're coming up to a very important election. And we need to start thinking about our future and where we go from here now. As we look at the civil rights movement in the United States, one of the strongest lessons that I draw from it is the importance of coalition building. That we cannot bring about success as a minority group if we don't have a critical mass from other communities in alliance with us. We cannot think of our issues as exclusively Muslim problems because they often are not. And that is especially the case when it comes to anti-Muslim bigotry or Islamophobia. Islamophobia feels to many of us as an incredibly isolating, very Muslim-specific problem. I was recently talking to a potential supporter of the organization I work for, the Institute for Social Policy and Understanding, and she said, we really want you all to do research that where you're looking at problems that are unique to the Muslim American community. And she said something like Islamophobia or civil rights violations. And I realized at that moment how isolating Islamophobic rhetoric is, and that in fact it is so by design. The goal of anti-Muslim bigots is to make the American Muslim community feel isolated, feel that they are on their own, to marginalize us psychologically before socially or politically. And so I want to first challenge the idea that Islamophobia is a Muslim problem. I don't think it's a Muslim problem, and I'm going to prove it to you. Islamophobia, or anti-Muslim bigotry, is in every way an American problem, and every single American who cares about the health of this democracy should be absolutely outraged by Islamophobic rhetoric. And this is how we have to approach this problem: by creating coalitions against this common threat. Because what you find when you do the research, and there was a very interesting report that ISPU put out a little under a year ago, is that anti-Muslim rhetoric and especially anti-Muslim legislation in the form of anti-Sharia legislation did not just impact Muslims. It was actually a part of a much wider movement to marginalized minority groups in general. It was a part of a wider anti-rights movement where when you look state by state at anti-Sharia legislation and you look up who is proposing this legislation, taking it to the floor of state legislators, you find that there is an 80% overlap between those legislators who are proposing that kind of legislation and these same legislators, these same lawmakers proposing legislation that curtails the rights of African Americans and Latinos, labor movements, women, immigrants, and other minority groups. What does that mean? It means that American Muslims are in fact just the first to suffer from a much wider toxic political climate. And when resisting this danger to American pluralism, we cannot afford to do it alone. We have to build coalitions. This is how the civil rights movement was won, and in fact, this is how the Prophet ﷺ also brought Islam back to his homeland in Mecca. It is by building coalitions. You know historically from the Sirah that when the Quraysh broke the peace treaty with the Muslims that ultimately led to the opening of Mecca, it was not because they attacked a Muslim tribe. It was actually because an ally of the Quraysh attacked an ally of the Muslims. And that ally of the Muslims was a non-Muslim tribe in alliance with the Muslims. Coalition building is how we make true progress. That's the first thing that I learned from the legacy of the American legacy of the civil rights movement. The second lesson, in addition to coalition building, is the need for multiple approaches to making change. There is a role for outside agitators, and there is a role for people who will engage, quote, at the table. And both of them are important, and both of them were needed to make real progress in the civil rights movement. The important thing is those who are at the table know that they are there representing a wider community and their interests, not there for their own sake. And those who are agitating have the same sincere intention. And that both approaches there's an allowance for both approaches to be taken. If you look at the civil rights movement, it couldn't have been won with one approach or another. And what we have to strive for is not conformity of strategy. That's not what unity actually is. Real unity is about being allowed to disagree safely. I was very proud to moderate a debate this afternoon between people from different perspectives on the question of do we engage or do we boycott. And why I felt so grateful being a part of this debate is that we were taking disagreement and we were making it safe. And as a community, we have to grow to do that more and more. Without that, we will not make more progress. So to disagree safely in our community. And then third, we have to approach the issues and the challenges we are facing from the perspective of being stakeholders, perspective of a sense of ownership, a sense of true citizenship. And that's the balance between feeling, on one hand, like we should be grateful guests, and on the other hand, of being hostile toward the United States of America. There is a balance between these two extremes. And that's why I get somewhat impatient with the question of, are American Muslims, quote, integrated? It actually makes no sense. Integrated into what? American Muslims are just American. And we have to approach progress in America as people who are trying to help build their own house. And one of the ways you protect your own house is by calling out the alarms when there is a toxic climate that is hurting everyone. Those things that hurt American Muslims, whether it's the erosion of civil liberties, racist rhetoric that has become acceptable, surveillance, entrapment, these are threats to American democratic health. One way to really see that, in addition to this idea of looking at the actual overlap of legislation, is neurological, it's psychological. When people are afraid, which is another name for Islamophobia, right? Phobia is a fear. People are fed fear day in and day out. Fear is the opposite of critical thinking. Fear promotes conformity. Fear promotes the acceptance of authoritarianism. And fear promotes prejudice. Fear erodes democracy. And that's how we should approach this issue, as stakeholders, as owners, as people who are at home and not asking to be welcomed. Thank you.
Barakallahu feeki. Our next speaker is my dear friend and one of the great activists of the American Muslim community, Nihad Awad. He is the executive director of CARE and has been in that position since CARE's founding in 1994. It's been that long, I think. And we can say, I think objectively, that CARE is one of the success stories in our American Muslim history. Brother Nihad.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم ومن والاه. Thank you, Dr. Bagby. It's a great honor to be with you this evening. It's also a great honor to be with Sister Dalia Mogahed and Dr. John Esposito, two individuals I greatly admire and respect, and I have learned in the past so much from them. But thank you very much, brothers and sisters, for sharing your evening with us. Tonight we're talking about the 1964 Civil Rights Act and its legacy. When it was passed in 1964, it was passed and signed by so many great leaders who believed in the vision of peace, equality for all. But let's also remember that in 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, it was designed to end slavery, but it did not end discrimination against African Americans. It took 100 years, from 1865 until 1964, to create a social change, a difference in the attitudes, in the hearts and minds of Americans, to look and see and treat African Americans as equals. It took generations of African Americans who suffered, who paid with their lives, so that a piece of legislation in 1964 to be passed into law that prohibits discrimination against people of color, against people who have faith, against people because of their national origin. It took so many years, and until today, despite the progress that we had, despite the fact that we have the first African-American president to the United States, when in 1965 it was not even a wishful thinking to think of. Until today, while discrimination has declined against African Americans and their middle class has grown, African Americans are still poor in the country, and there is rife discrimination against African Americans. So it is unfinished business. So 50 years until and after the passage of that act, there is still discrimination. It is less, but it is still discrimination. And African Americans, although they feel empowered and they have the greatest number of elected officials in Congress and in other places, many of them go back to segregated and poor neighborhoods. The level of unemployment among African Americans is twice of the unemployment rate among white Americans. So disparity is still there. But let me turn and shift gear to a personal story. How the 1964 Civil Rights Act impacted us as American Muslims and as me as an individual. Like many of you were not even born when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was passed. I was a few years old, living in a refugee camp in Amman, Jordan. Little I knew, probably I was running in the dusty alleys of that refugee camp when the 1964 Civil Rights Act was signed. Little I knew that I would travel to the United States, and I will go to the university, and I will meet with African Americans, and with Asian Americans, and with Malaysian Americans, to learn more about America, to learn more about universal Islam. Little I knew when I was in a refugee camp that I will start in the future the first and largest Muslim civil rights and advocacy organization for American Muslims that utilizes the 1964 Civil Rights Act to defend the rights of millions of Muslim Americans. Little I knew that millions of American Muslims would be standing on the shoulders of millions of African Americans who suffered and struggled for centuries for basic human rights and freedoms. Little I knew that I would quote the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and in particular Title VII, in letters to corporations, to public schools, to private schools, defending the rights of Muslims who felt discrimination just because they're Muslim. My organization, CARE, has utilized this 1964 Civil Rights Act and Title VII in particular thousands of times in defending the rights of Muslim sisters wearing hijab, in defending the rights of thousands of Muslims wearing beard, in defending the rights of thousands of Muslims who want to go for Hajj and they need to be accommodated and change their schedule to fit the timing of the season of Hajj. We have quoted Title VII of 1964 Civil Rights Act to defend the rights of Muslims who felt that they were mistreated because of their Muslim identity, in airports, in the workplace, in the school system. Brothers and sisters, the reason I'm sharing this story with you, because most of us American Muslims, especially immigrant Muslims, and those who were born after 1964, should be grateful to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for those freedoms. But also we should be grateful to our African American brothers and sisters. And we should be grateful to them because had it not been for their struggle, had it not been for their courage, had it not been for their sacrifice, we would not be enjoying the freedoms that we enjoy today at the workplace, in the school system, in our places of worship nationwide. And therefore, as Muslims, we believe in social justice. We believe in harmony. It is a core value of Islam. Justice and social justice are core values of Islam. We cannot just preach them, we need to live them, and we need to practice them. When we look today at the mosaic and landscape of American Muslims, even in this small hall, we feel the beauty of the universality of Islam. We see the unity of mankind. We see the unity of the Ummah. However, when we look back to the Muslim world or at the Muslim world, we don't see social harmony. We do not see ethnic equality. We do not see religious equality. We do not see gender equality. We see division. We see disunity. We see fights. We see wars. We see death and destruction. It is not because of Islam, it is despite Islam. And that's why we here at home, we should live up to the ideals of Islam and to the ideals of the constitution of this great nation. And we should take care of our internal business. This is one of the first lessons that we need to look at. And I appeal to specifically my brothers and sisters in the Arab community, and especially those who called African Americans Abid. I ask you to stop it. It is derogatory, it is discrimination, it is un-Islamic to call African Americans slaves. Had it not been to African Americans' struggle, we would not enjoy the freedoms that you and I enjoy even to speak now. And therefore, brothers and sisters, we have to admire and look up to our African American brothers and sisters. I say it because I am the first one to benefit from their struggle in this country. And as a Muslim, I owe it to my brothers and sisters to look at them and respect them and feel them the respect and the love and the compassion that my religion endowed on me, but also it is the law of the land. Once I stood up to a friend who called African Americans Abid. And since then, he did not speak to me. And I do not regret it. And we need to live up to our ideals and our values. Another thing, since the description of this session is to talk about divisions, We cannot allow as Muslims, especially in the United States, to be divided among Shia and Sunni. We are one ummah. We are one ummah. Before we ask religious scholars to wake up from their fantasy about who is Muslim and who is not, we need to practice and promote social harmony and religious unity within the Muslim community at home and in our communities. Then people will see that we preach and we promote things we believe in and we practice it. Another aspect that the description of this session asked us to address is gender disequality. And we Muslims should pay due respect in practice to our sisters in our communities. We should not just talk about them, but we have to elevate them and allow them to seek positions of power within our communities, including to become presidents of our organizations and to serve in leadership positions, and to expand and make sure that they have enough space in our mosques. Enough space in our mosques and appropriate entrances and special and appropriate accommodation in our mosques to our sisters. We cannot talk about the social status of women in Islam when we do not respect them properly in our mosques, in our community centers. If we learn anything from the social and political and civil rights movement, we really have to live these values in our communities. Brothers and sisters, I fully agree and endorse what Sister Dalia Mogahed said about building coalitions. Today, we have to work with others. African American issues are American Muslim issues. They are American issues. They are universal issues. And let me be more specific. We notice and witness an increase in killing unarmed African Americans, young African Americans in the streets today. The Muslim community should speak more forcefully against police brutality. Last year, when Michael Brown was gunned down in Ferguson, Missouri, I decided to go to Ferguson, Missouri to attend the funeral service. I went to the church, and I thought I would be among thousands of people who support African Americans. Unfortunately, when I looked around in the church in Ferguson, there were only a handful of people who were not African Americans. And that was outrageous. If we want to show and exhibit solidarity and unity, we should show up when we see injustice taking place. When there is injustice taking place against one community, it is injustice against all communities in the United States. And we need not to be reminded by another tragedy. It should be intuitive. It should be simultaneous reaction when we see that injustice is a threat to justice everywhere. And I call upon all our communities to show up in these protests. Even when a police officer is gunned down by protesters, we have to speak up. Because also police officers who are doing their duty to protect all of us, they need the support. And therefore, our approach to this issue should be balanced. Learning from building coalitions is a must. Today, we feel that we have fought as a nation segregation in schools and restaurants who only decided to serve white Americans and denied service to African Americans, to Jews and Latinos. Today, that phenomenon is coming back to the surface. in the phenomenon of the spread of Muslim-free zones. We see now a widespread in different cities and states where certain stores and restaurants put up signs, Muslim-free zone. This cannot be allowed to continue. This has serious consequences on the civil rights of American Muslims and the social harmony of America. And therefore, it should not be only up to American Muslims to go and challenge this bigotry and this discrimination against Muslims. A few days ago, 82 national and local organizations have appealed to the Justice Department to investigate this phenomenon. But I ask you, brothers and sisters, to organize locally against these stores and to build coalitions to fight back against Islamophobia. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect all of you. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you so much, Brother Nihad. ISNA is actually working on one of the points that Brother Nihad mentioned, and also Sister Dalia, of making our masjids more women-friendly. A task force, an ISNA task force composed of sisters, has produced a statement that has been reviewed and modified by the Fiqh Council, endorsed by the Fiqh Council, and many other scholars. Inshallah, if you have not signed on to that statement, we are asking everybody to sign that statement. And you can do that at the ISNA booth. Just show your support for this concept of making our masjids more women-friendly. And also, we have a poster. You can actually put your name, and inshallah, maybe that poster will become a historical document. But please, before you leave this convention center, make sure you go to the ISNA booth and show your support for this effort. Our next speaker is probably the best friend of the American Muslim community, and that is John Esposito. He is still a professor at Georgetown University, professor of Islamic Studies, and of course he was longtime director of the Prince Al-Walid Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding, and now he is taking one step away from that. He's retired from that, but he is still teaching, and he's produced so many books that you can't even count them. Brother John.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and after listening to Dalia and Nihad, I really don't have much more to say, so I'm going to come at it from a different perspective, but I'll be covering some of the territory. You know, when I thought about what I was supposed to speak about tonight, frankly, I couldn't figure out how to get my handle around it, and I do a fair amount of speaking. And then I decided to think about the issues of racism, the issues of freedom of religion, of civil liberties, of gender equality, but to think about them and take a look at how they play out in the past, and then where are we today in the present. If you think about it, we had the Declaration of Independence in 1776, the Constitution in 1789. We Americans celebrate our principles and values: equality, freedoms, civil liberties. But what's the reality? If you look at the Washington Post, August 27 of this year, there's an article that really talks about the fact that the United States, as great a nation as we are historically, has never been all that friendly to the outsider, to the immigrants. Look at the realities. In 1882, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, basically excluding Chinese because they were seen as bringing the danger of polluting our culture and would take our jobs. You have in the 19th and early 20th century bigotry towards Italian Americans. And it's very interesting to me, being half Sicilian and half Neapolitan, that most of the Italian Americans that first came were from Sicily, and we are dark-skinned. We get even darker in the summertime. And as a result, there were those who saw us as subhuman, and Italian Americans were hanged very often in southern states. You have the prejudice against ethnic Catholics, the beginning of a political party called the Know-Nothings, the discrimination and the violence that occurred. And in fact, when people wanted to criticize President Lincoln, his critics often said he was a secret Catholic. When some wanted to criticize Franklin Roosevelt, they said he was Jewish. And we know, as of last week, 54% of Republicans think President Obama is a Muslim. It's interesting to see a little bit of a bridge and to realize that the problems of discrimination, of bigotry, of dealing with immigration have been inherent, not because it's something peculiar to America, because in fact we do at the end of the day represent a mosaic. And we may have a problem bringing in new folks, but they ultimately become absorbed. We have a hell of a lot better record than Europe does. And I think we're still decades ahead. But the heart of it is not really America. From my point of view, it's human nature. And that plays a significant fact. Now, let's take a look at the Muslim community itself very briefly. Muslims came here, a significant number, as immigrants. African-American Muslims, in the American mind, have generally been hidden by that reality. Too often when people talk about Muslims and write stories about Muslims, it tends to be American Muslims and Muslims overseas. To show you how much the African-American Muslim community is sometimes overlooked, I once did a PBS show on Warithuddin Muhammad. And the reporter, they called me, they wanted to speak about black Muslims. And I explained, they wanted to talk about Farrakhan, and I explained the role of Warithuddin, how he had so many more followers, the role that he plays in mainstream Islam. And there was still a hesitancy. And then they came and they did the interview. We did the whole thing, but we spent a lot of time on Warithuddin. And during the break, the reporter said, "Are you really sure that we ought to be covering this area? I mean, showing you how this area gets dwarfed." If you look at the American Muslim experience in general of the immigrant community, they too had the problems of coming to America, of having to fit in, of initially, as Catholics and others did, the community naturally, for cultural, religious, linguistic reasons, is turned in on itself. But if you look at the history of ISNA and other major Muslim groups, you see that progression over the years. That focus at meetings such as this at ISNA years ago, which were primarily concerned with, okay, what are American Muslims facing, being really narrowly defined in terms of obviously the community and its sticking together, prospering and surviving as a minority, and increasingly opening up and defining itself vis-a-vis the local community, not just the local Muslim community, but the city and town, vis-a-vis the region, vis-a-vis the country, and also internationally. And that's a bit of what I want to touch on. ISNA, MSA, CARE, MAS, ICNA, MPAC, IPSU, IIIT, and there are other Muslim organizations whom I haven't mentioned, but I mention a number of them because I've known them for quite a while. As one of my employees said the other day when she heard I was married 50 years, she said, "Oh my God, you've been married twice as long as I've been alive." Well, I've been around even longer than that. But there are other organizations. But these organizations we see have increasingly, when you look at their panels at their programs, but you also look at their activities, become more and more conscious of plugging into the national scene and the global scene. But what does that mean? Dalia touched on this, and it was implicit in what Nihad said. What it means is that more and more, as one goes regional, local, regional, and global, one has to more and more think about working in coalitions. In other words, you develop, if you will, a more pluralistic approach, but it also ought to be that kind of pluralistic approach, the idea that one works in coalitions with others, with other groups, Jews, Catholics, African Americans, and others who have had to struggle in the past and continue to struggle today. Because the irony about America is that it took 200 years to address racism and gender equality, and decades have gone by, and we're still facing those issues. And Muslims are part of the mosaic of America, and so you have an investment in that, but also you will continue to be, for some time to come, both prospering and a victim. That's the great irony when you look at Gallup data and other studies. On the one hand, Muslims have prospered so well, educationally, economically, and increasingly in the political system. And at the same time that you experience victimhood as well, there's also a belief in the American dream. An American dream that I was raised with, an American dream that doesn't exist unless you're lucky. I'm not attacking the American dream, but I think one wants to put that in perspective. But what does it mean then in working in coalition on these issues? It means being aware that issues of racism and immigration, for example, or gender equality, are in fact global. All you have to do is put the news on now and look at what is happening globally, how Europeans are both facing and running away from the massive immigration problem. An immigration problem that, yes, comes from within many Muslim countries. It comes from the governments, it comes from many of the elites, but it also comes from the influence of Western powers and their foreign policies. Invasion, occupation, violations of human rights, etc. And so there is a reason for seeing that there is a need to come together globally. And here I'm going to bring my comments to a conclusion by bringing up some examples and saying, on the one hand, I celebrate the extent to which I see so many Muslim organizations now, whether they're called Islamic Relief, whether they have the word Islam in front of it, or whether it's a Muslim NGO, realizing that all problems impact Muslims. And Muslims are part of that mosaic, and that means whether it's Katrina, whether it's what's happening to immigrants who are being discriminated against today, whether they're Muslims or not in this country, or immigrants overseas, all those problems are Muslim problems because Muslims are Americans and they are American problems. But what does that really mean? I celebrate the fact that my colleagues here and many of you have been able to have a greater profile in your towns, your cities, and have in fact been welcomed by government officials. But don't let iftars simply become take a Muslim to lunch or a Muslim to dinner. I've said that for years, and what I mean by that is that it's not enough to have government reach out to you. It's not enough to dialogue about the comfortable issues that government's ready to dialogue about. It's also raising the uncomfortable issues. What about surveillance and interrogation? What about a country that has and should have zero tolerance for terrorism, but should also have zero tolerance for those who are arrested and are not guilty but imprisoned? We have a significant number of American Muslims who are in prison in the United States and shouldn't be there. Lawyers that I know who handle these cases tell me that, even more than the Bush administration, the Obama administration's number of arrests of frivolous, not those that are genuine arrests and convictions, but those that prove to be frivolous, but regrettably, some of which actually move forward and innocent people are put into prison, that number is significant. We look at the Syrian refugee problem. I heard an interesting statistic last night on PBS, or maybe the night before. No, it was last night. Germany has pledged to take 800,000 refugees, not just Syrians, but refugees, but many of them are Syrians and from other countries. 800,000. Germany is the size of Montana. If you were to put now this on a scale for the United States, it would mean that the United States would take 3.2 million immigrants. Look at the immigration debate in this country today, particularly right now with Trump and the Republicans. Look at the fact that, yes, Assad is responsible. Look at the fact that jihadist groups are responsible, that ISIL is responsible. But also look at the fact that Western foreign policy also contributed to a great deal of the destabilization in Iraq and what has happened in Iraq, that the dragging of the feet of Western powers over the last 4 years to intervene effectively and to form an effective coalition with Arab and Muslim governments with regard to responding to Syria has contributed to the problem, not to the solution. And disturbingly, and I don't know if this is true, but I saw it in a reputable news source, that a representative of the US government said the other day that it is terrible what is going on in Syria and what is happening to Syrian immigrants. But then the next breath said the United States didn't have any intention of increasing its immigration quota. According to PBS last night, only 1,800 Syrians have been brought into the country in the last 4 years. 2 final points. Let's remember what's happening globally. When Anwar Ibrahim came to this country as Deputy Prime Minister, and he would call my wife and I up because we've known him for 35 years and say, come and visit us at the hotel in Washington, my wife and I, you could not get through the crowd. And when Anwar would come out to welcome us and lead us through the crowd, there were some who just looked and said, why are these people being ushered in? So we had American Muslims who couldn't get enough of Anwar, you know, the Muslim that made it in power. Where is the American Muslim and the European Muslim communities? Where are they on the Anwar Ibrahim situation, which has gone on, and the current trial? Where are they speaking out? And not only speaking out, but speaking truth to power when it comes to our own government. And finally, what about Egypt? What about a coup? What about the massive violation of human rights? What about an Egyptian coup and a post-period in which, according to all experts, there has been more violence and violation of human rights than under any contemporary Egyptian leader, from Nasser to Sadat to Mubarak? Now, some have spoken out. I'm not saying that American Muslims haven't, but we have to speak out, we Americans, Muslim or not, far more forcefully. That situation has gotten worse rather than better. And finally, because we're running out of time, let me just do a brief promotion for the center, which was created 22 years ago. I want to thank my colleague for making it clear I have not retired. I will not retire. I have trained a nurse to carry me in on a gurney so that as long as I can speak, I will be at Georgetown. And I run 8 miles a day to make sure of that. But the reality of it is, and I'd like to alert you to it, when you get a chance, go to bridge.georgetown.edu. I think it's .edu or .net. We have launched a new multi-year program addressing Islamophobia. We call it The Bridge, Protecting Pluralism and Ending Islamophobia. You will see a state-of-the-art website. We are doing a lot of things which I won't go into because we have more of this program to go to. But I do want to emphasize that, as both of our speakers said before, at the end of the day, we're not out of the woods when it comes to addressing the issue of Islamophobia. It not only affects our domestic situation here and in Europe, it affects the foreign policy of some European and some American administrations. Thank you.
We don't want you to retire, John. We need your voice. Our last speaker is our dear sister, Laila Muhammad. Laila Muhammad has been a longtime activist and community organizer, especially in the Chicago area, in the areas of domestic violence, conflict resolution, and she has training in this area. And she's also the daughter of Imam Warathuddin Muhammad, Sister Laila. And she is a poet. She has a book of poetry if you want to sample it.
With Allah's name, the merciful benefactor, the merciful redeemer. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be unto everyone. I'm going to start firstly by saying that I feel that when I'm with Muslims in the majority, I feel that I'm with family and I can be very frank and comfortable. And before I begin, I ask Allah to have mercy on me and to guide my words, and that the good that I say comes from Him, and that the mistakes I make, I ask that He forgive me, and that I ask that you excuse me. Now, I began with the words that are very important to me and to Muslims, and that is that Allah is most merciful. And in His mercy, we have had decades of Islam in America. And it is a mercy to us because we have somewhat of an example and a pattern of how to live in such a diverse country, but also in a country that gives a false dream. The speaker before me, I totally agree with him. I was raised to believe somewhat in the American dream, but as my father, Imam Warathuddin Muhammad, said, may Allah forgive and reward him, he said that there is an ugly America and that there is a beautiful America. Now, to some that might be a little uncomfortable, but that's just a fact of human nature. Human beings have ugliness, human beings have beauty. And it is the human experience that struggles with that balance. Brother Baghdadi said that I should give some words of advice or suggestions as to what immigrant Muslims should do or what can be done in America. Am I correct? Okay. So I don't know if I can do that other than to say that foremost, we should just practice what we believe openly and very simplistic. When we see another human being, we should not prejudge them and speak to them in kindness. Say, peace be unto you. If you know they're Muslims, then say, assalamu alaikum. And if you're not comfortable with that, just smile. That's Islam. I have, for the past three years, had the opportunity to work in an area that has been given names that I feel are true, but sensationalized. And that is this whole Chirac idea. I think it insults Chicago. I think it insults Iraq. But I want you to know the area that I'm talking about, the south side of Chicago, where I witnessed across the street from my place of employment a car driving on the playground where children were playing. And one of the young ladies came into the center where I was upset, and she just kept saying, she called me Sister Laila. Sister Laila, they ran over him, they ran over him. This is where these children live. And what we can do as Muslims is to show them our Muslim face, to smile at them, to treat them kind. Now, that might sound off the track or off the subject. However, it is not. The Muslims that came from the experience that I came from, that pioneered the experience, the Muslims that were in America from the 1930s and that are still here. Some people say it's a fossilized community. It is a growing and thriving community. The old picture has been fossilized. The picture of black has been buried. It is now the true face of Islam. Those people that came from the social reforming movement of the Nation of Islam, those people that came from Imam Muhammad bringing us into the true Islam as was revealed in the Quran to our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, those Muslims who, and those people who, if you look next to you, may be sitting next to you, but you don't know because they look like you. Those people got Islam respected in America by being righteous, by being kind, by being self-sufficient, but also by being strong, by being opinionated, by standing up for what they believed and not being ashamed, by holding the names that derive from the Quran and the attributes of Allah and holding them up high. My advice is simply to find someone, something, some group that has a like mind as yourself. Join with them in their efforts of good and collectively work on that you're concerned with. And continue to move throughout the beautiful fabric of America as Muslim. What do I mean by that? Somebody that prays 5 times a day, somebody that fasts, somebody that wears the jilbab, somebody that wears the abaya. No, that's not what I mean. I mean someone who submits to the will of Allah, someone who's human, that makes a mistake sometime, but asks Allah to forgive them and keep trying to be the best that they can be. Someone who looks in the mirror and checks themselves. Someone who looks at their brother or sister and pulls them to the right. A Muslim. In closing, I'm going to read this poem, and I don't think of myself as a poet, but ideas sometimes come to me and I put them in somewhat of a rhythm because I like that, and it's soothing to my soul. When I was sitting here, I thought about that it's been 7 years since I last spoke at ISNA, and that was on the invitation after the passing of my father, Imam Muhammad. It was in D.C. And not too long after that, I wrote this poem maybe about 3 years after he passed. And I was still grieving, not because I had a problem with him passing, because I know that Allah knows best and he's the best of planners, but that I miss my dad, and I miss my mentor, and I miss my imam. So this came to my mind, and I think it's relevant to all of us. And it's relevant to us as a collective whole in America and in the world. It's called moving. So I guess I could say this is my advice to my brothers and sisters of the term indigenous, but also to immigrant, also to simply the human family, any God-conscious person. It's entitled Moving. I find myself trying to stay afloat in the vast ocean where the floor cannot be seen. I find myself trying to stay afloat. My tears flow like rivers for loved ones lost, and a fear of lost loved ones to come. In this difficult time, I try to keep a clear mind and remember that Allah said, with difficulty comes ease. I find myself trying to stay afloat. I anticipate the ease, for the future is upon the shore. So for now, I'll tread, I'll swim, and sometimes float. However, I will always move with the gift of life, trying and reaching the shore. For then, and only then, I will rest and be able to say that I have pleased my Lord, for I never gave up on serving him. I continue to move throughout this land, throughout this shared freedom space. I continued to move as a servant of Allah. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much, brothers and sisters.
Thank you so much, Sister Laila Muhammad. May Allah bless you. Barakallahu fiki. As we close, because we started a little late, but we cannot really violate our mandate to keep to our time, I want to thank all of our speakers tonight. If there's anything I think they have highlighted is, one, that we need to build coalitions. This was a theme in almost everybody's talk. We need to also be engaged in the issues that face America, not just the issues that face Muslims in this country. We need to also appreciate the African American experience. Almost everybody mentioned this. And I think we have a long way to go in that regard, because as Brother Nihad alluded to, we have racism within our own community. The reality is that African American Muslims and other Muslims from all over the world and their children still have not really come together. We have still much work to do to bring our hearts together, to really manifest the beauty of brotherhood and the oneness of our community, which was the example of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his very diverse community in Medina. This is advice and a challenge for our community. Subhanakal bihamdik nashhadu an la ilaha illa ant wa nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Welcome to the 52nd Annual ISNA Convention. Stories of resilience, strengthening the American Muslim narrative.